If you don't know me, my name's Dr. Jacob Roram. I work here doing public programs at the History Center, and I'm really happy to welcome you here. This is our 20th season of History Forum. It's pretty amazing. I had the great privilege of getting to step into a series that was already well underway and well beloved, and I'm excited to be able to continue that. I think one of the great things about this, that might be a little better. One of the great things about this series is we get to bring to St. Paul scholars that are doing excellent work in historical scholarship. And I think one of the things that, we all are guilty of is we tend to gravitate towards the things we already know, that we're already comfortable with, the ones that we already like. We like, oh, I love history, this part of history. And this is a great opportunity for us to learn from people who are doing excellent work, bringing new evidence to our attention, bringing new methodologies, asking new questions, and really broadening our understanding of the past in really wonderful ways. So I hope today's lecture is something that sparks curiosity for you and continues to allow you to continue to learn more about Minnesota and about American history, because this series really is a much broader scope than we usually take on here at the History Center. Most of our stuff is Minnesota in scope. But this is still regional, and I'm excited to have that, to be able to bring something that's very much in touch with here in the Midwest. So I want to just draw your attention there. We have upcoming events. I know a lot of you are going to be planning to already be here for our next History Forum with Dr. Casey Keeler. She's at University of Wisconsin. She has a great new history of the Twin Cities, looking specifically at the urbanization and particularly the suburbanization of American Indians, which is not something that has really been done before. A lot of times our histories of American Indians here in Minnesota and across the United States have been about either urban populations or about reservation populations. And this is something that she's really seeking out a new way of thinking about placemaking for American Indians here, specifically in the Twin Cities. It's going to be a terrific talk. We also have upcoming events of all kinds. So, if History Forum's the only thing you usually come to, check out all the other things we have going on. mnhs.org. You can just check the events. We got tons of great stuff. Before we begin, I also want to just acknowledge that we are here on the ancestral and contemporary homelands of the Dakota people. And the reason I say that, a lot of times we think, oh, why do we have to hear that again? I think it's really good to remember that the places we are and the reasons and the processes and the historical events that allowed us to be here really demand us to ask good questions here in the present and think about how we can partner with our indigenous neighbors to create a better future for all Minnesotans. We as the Historical Society, we operate across the entire state, which shares its geography with 11 Dakota and Anishinaabe nations, and we do really great work here to continue to partner with them in telling a fuller history of Minnesota, but also to be able to do great things like our Native American Undergraduate Museum Fellowship, where we bring in Native undergraduate students to learn museum studies and public history so that they continue to serve across the nation in various roles. We do an Artist in Residence program with Native artists where they get to use our collections to inspire their continuing work, which is really a fabulous program. So it's really something that I love to be able to highlight the great work of our Native American Initiatives Department. If you have not seen our new exhibit, Reframing Our Stories, it's really terrific. It's old, not very old. A lot of photographs from the Star Tribune archives. That literally was a box that just labeled Indians. And so our folks here have been doing great work to build those backstories back into these photographs and really tell a great story that these are capturing. So I hope you can take a look at that. Also, I just want to point out we have a new exhibit coming in February, Black Citizenship in the Age of Jim Crow. It opens February 3rd. Keep an eye out for more information about that. So I've talked a lot. You didn't come here to hear me talk. So I want to introduce today's speaker. So Dr. Edward Curtis is the William M. and Gail M. Plater Chair of the Liberal Arts and a professor of religious studies at Indiana University in Indianapolis. He's done a lot of work on the history of Muslims here in America and Arab Americans, including 14 books that he's written or been the editor of, including Muslims of the Heartland, which is the topic of today's lecture. If you want to pick up that book, it's in our bookshop for sale, and it was just recently awarded a book prize from the National Arab American. It was the National Arab American Book Prize. Yes. He's also, one of the things I love about, as I got to know his work, is he's a very much engaged public scholar. And there's a lot of great work that he's done to engage the public in the work of history, and that's something we are always ready and willing to celebrate here at MNHS. So please join me for a Minnesota welcome, Dr. Edward E. Curtis.
Good morning. How is the lavalier mic? Are we good up there? You can hear me well? Everybody can hear me? Fantastic. Let us know if you ever can't hear me. Just raise your hand, make a ruckus, whatever you need to do. I want to make sure. And welcome to all those who are at home or streaming us live. It's a real pleasure to be back in the Twin Cities. I was at Macalester College, I don't know, about a year ago or so, and spent a few days as a visiting scholar with the students talking about this same subject, and it's always a pleasure. I wish that I could come back and see a game at Target Field. That's my goal. But we're going to have to make that happen. So let me dive right in and tell you about the origins of this project of Muslims of the Heartland. Oftentimes an academic, a scholar, or a professor, when they are going to tell you about their project, they're going to tell you what theory that their work is based on. And sometimes that theory is based on some French theorist's unpronounceable name, like Baudrillard, Foucault, or something like that. Well, the main theorist for this book was my maternal grandmother. There's Granny right there dancing with me towards the end of her life. And the reason why she was the theorist for this book was she was the Arab American grandmother who raised me in southern Illinois to know about her life as, not just as a resident of southern Illinois, but as a Midwesterner. And it was because of those stories that she shared with me that I would later could develop the imagination of thinking about Muslims of the Heartland, Muslims of the region in the Midwest, as people who were connected to one another. Because Granny told me that she would, as a young girl, attend hafles and maharajans, or parties and festivals in Terre Haute, Indiana, where some of the parents hope to marry off their children to other Arabic-speaking Syrian and Lebanese people. And it was Granny who told me about our Humsey cousins in Cedar Rapids, whom she would visit during the summers on long road trips by the interwar period. And she loved to go to St. Louis to go shopping, where she would see the Armenians and the Greeks and the Syrian Lebanese and pick up olive oil and other things. And she met my grandfather when she was a student at St. Mary's College in South Bend, Indiana. He had been recruited, he and his brother Ferris were the Safa brothers out of Drumright, Oklahoma, who had been recruited by Knute Rockne to play football at Notre Dame. And our people have always been, the history of football in this country is littered with all kinds of accomplishments of Arabic-speaking immigrants or their children. The National Football League wouldn't be what it is today without people like Joe Robbie and Abe Jabron and you name it. Okay, so we weren't as good as ice hockey. We were not as, preferred football. So it was Granny who had really sort of, shaped, if you will, the software up here so that I could even think about this. And I was sensitive to these stories. There are other descendants just like me in the Midwest who experienced something similar. One of the families featured in my book is represented today by Kamel and Patty Ossie, or it would look to you like Aosi, but it's Ossie. Just raise your hands. Yes, thank you. They are in the book that you might pick up and read. Their family is. Is anyone else here a descendant of these original Syrian Lebanese settlers today? I just want to acknowledge you if you're there. If you're there. I don't see anyone else. Well, let me tell you about us. Where did these settlers come from? From around 1880 until 1920, 500,000 Syrian Lebanese people and Palestinians. At that time, it was all ruled by the Ottoman Empire, and it was all part of the Eastern Mediterranean. Almost 1 out of every 5 Eastern Mediterraneans left their homeland for the New World. 500,000 people. 100,000 went to Argentina, 100,000 to Brazil, and 100,000 to the United States. The 200,000 went everywhere else. And so you have Syrian Lebanese communities across the Americas. Okay. And many of the people, my history is not a comprehensive history, but these are the villages, mostly from the Bekaa Valley, from which the characters and the families, well, hold on, here we go. Right here, the Bekaa Valley, came from. But you can see they came from various parts of what today is Lebanon and was then simply part of Greater Syria. They were pushed by a modernizing economy that had created economic dislocation and also the failure of the silk industry in Lebanon and the Turkification of the Young Turks and the Ottoman Empire. A variety of factors will push them. But why did they come here? Why the Midwest, of all places? The mother colony, the Syrian mother colony, was in New York. Why didn't they just go to the East Coast? Well, one of the answers to that is if we look at this railroad map from 1901. The Midwest was an economic powerhouse of this country in the late 1800s. There's a reason why the Columbian Exposition of 1893 occurred in Chicago, Illinois. Let's see here. I'm still learning how to use this particular one. You can see how these railroads indicate railroads represented enormous investment and economic activity. You can see, of course, the Twin Cities being a huge railroad town and very important to the industrial and agricultural boom of the late 1800s. This was the land of opportunity in the late 1800s, and that's why many of these economic migrants came to the Midwest and not to the East Coast or the West Coast. In fact, one of the contributions of this research is to show that even though our community was small, the lives of Ottoman Syrian Muslims reveal how our region, the Midwest, worked as an interconnected region, a human geography in the early 1900s. What do I mean by human geography? Well, what in the world do the short grass prairies of the plain states have to do with the lush and thick forests of southern Illinois? I mean, that doesn't go together, right? Not at least in terms of a physical geography. This is a human geography. We, the people, created the Midwest as a geography. And it was during this period when it really came to be known as this economic powerhouse. One of the reasons they came was to take industrial jobs. The United States and in particular the Great Lakes region was going through an industrial growth of incredible proportions. And so the largest employer in the state of Indiana was the Haskell-Barker Railroad Car Company in 1900. And John Barker specifically recruited Arabic-speaking immigrants to work in this factory because he figured that they weren't very good at speaking English and they were unlikely to become good English speakers, and that was useful to him because he wanted to keep the workers from speaking with one another to form unions. And so he recruits these Arabic speakers, and they come for these jobs, and so many of many people many Arabic-speaking Syrian Muslims come to Michigan City for these jobs, as you can see in the city directory. One of the challenges that I faced as a researcher was to figure out, now look how many Joe Alis there are on this list. Sometimes it was difficult to figure out which Yusuf Ali we were talking about here. I mean, they're all working at, they're from the same village, oftentimes. Most of these would have been Shia Muslims. And they come from, so these are all, and the other thing you have to be aware of is how their names were transliterated. Usually today, we would transliterate the name Ali as A-L-I. But here, and the other thing you would see is they might have spelled it A-L-L-E-Y as well. Okay, so these are, you can see they all work at H&B, Haskell and Barker Car Company, and you can see the various jobs that they did in the factory there. So that's one of the reasons that people came, right, for work, factory work in the Midwest. Okay, why else would people have come to the Midwest at this time in 1900? Well, this is, let me tell you the story of the Ogdi family. You could say, sometimes it's Ogdi, sometimes it's A'adi. They would have said A'adi in their Syrian Lebanese Arabic. The Ogdi family from South Dakota. This is Ali Ogdi, or Ogdi, okay, and Fatima Ogdi, okay, with their kids. Ali got his start as a peddler. He lived in this tiny, right by the Great Sioux River, okay, and he lived with a bunch of other guys who were coming to Sioux Falls, South Dakota to become a researcher. And you can tell they're all living in a border house here. And here he is. Here, instead of Ogdi, they have it as Ogda, Alec, instead of Ali. Right? So here's Alec Ogdi. And by the way, the reason I could figure out this was him was I had to, I'd gather a lot of evidence from a lot of different sources, and I'd put him at that place in 1900 and figure out, no, this was definitely Ali Ogdi. Okay, so he would live here. He could get, look, he's got his telegraph. He's got all kinds. He's got his cigar factory right outside the Great Sioux River there. I'm sure I actually wouldn't want to live there when the river was flooding, but So why he starts out as a peddler, but then he becomes a homesteader. Now, how did that opportunity come about? In the 1880s. The U.S. Congress changed its mind and decided to violate the treaties that they had signed with native nations to set aside in perpetuity most of the western half of what would become North and South Dakota in a reservation. And they decided that they could make better use of that land by taking it away from native nations, dividing it up into 40-acre parcels, and giving it out to homesteaders. And so they dispossessed the Indian land, and this created enormous opportunities for the immigrants who missed out on homesteading in places like Iowa and Minnesota, who could go west. It also created enormous opportunities for the railroad companies who could invest in new railroad lines, get a lot of land for doing so, and hopefully make a lot of money transporting grain and livestock on the new lines. So it was part of a whole speculation. So many people profited from the stealing of the land from native nations. So, hold on one second. So this western part of the Dakotas, that was all set aside in perpetuity for what was called the Great Sioux Reservation. Whether or not someone like Ali Ogdi knew this, or the Swedish or Norwegian immigrants who would take these homesteads, is not clear. They ended up being part of the history of land dispossession, but they didn't necessarily know that this was so. And the life that they led is the life that how many of you all have somewhere encountered, either in your family history or in your study, the harsh weather faced by the homesteaders in Minnesota or in the Dakotas. Several of you know this is part of our lore. And indeed, they would oftentimes put up these tar paper shacks, which wasn't much protection. They weren't much protection from that minus 20-degree weather in the short grass prairies of western North Dakota. They suffered quite a lot. In the case of the Ogden family, they were living right outside of Kadoka, South Dakota, which was the gateway to the Badlands. Anybody been to the Badlands here? Most of you. Oh, this is amazing. All right. When I give this talk in Ohio, nobody's ever been. Okay, so they now, if you've been there, then you can imagine how hard it would be with a horse and a metal plow to actually grow wheat right there in the Badlands. This wasn't a very good idea. So eventually we had depopulation in the western Dakotas because it just couldn't sustain intensive agriculture. But something else happened here that Fatima, before they ever failed, something happened to Fatima and the kids. She's out hanging up the wash one day and to dry, and she's got the dog and the kids there, and a rattlesnake starts making its way for the kids. And she says to Ali, first the rattlesnake comes and she's really scared. The rattlesnake bites and kills the dog. As it's making its way for the kids, she's already got her tool. And anyone who knows Fatima knows that she was an intrepid soul. And she's making its way and she kills the rattlesnake. When Ali gets back from peddling, she issues an ultimatum. You know, dear husband, you're either moving in with me to Sioux Falls or I'm going back to Syria. Ali obliges and they move to Sioux Falls and get out of western South Dakota. He still proves up. What's called proving up is you have to improve the land that you take, and he takes deed eventually to, in this case, it's 120 acres. Am I seeing? Let's see here. I don't know. Yeah. I think it's 120. There, and look at his name there. See, different spelling again. So you have to get used to these different acres. Okay. One of the questions. So they come for economic opportunity as farmers, as industrial workers, as entrepreneurs and peddlers, right? Many different jobs. Do they face discrimination? Socially, yes, absolutely. No doubt, all over the place. Do they face legal discrimination? Now that depends on the locality and the era, okay? Because for the purposes of homesteading and they are classified in the U.S. Census as white. Now, why is that important? Because if you're Asian, you are ineligible in 1890 and 1900 to become a naturalized citizen of the United States. In the 1880s, the U.S. Congress passes a series of acts which make Asian people ineligible for naturalized citizenship. So if you can't become a naturalized citizen, that means you can't get free land from the government because only those who can become citizens are allowed to take this land. The Syrians are classified as white, and so they have that white privilege at least as far as it comes to homesteading. But then, in 1908 and 1909, the U.S. government changes its mind about their whiteness. The Secretary of Commerce and Labor tells all of the local immigration judges who are naturalizing these Syrians, at that time they were just called Syrians. Remember, there's no Lebanon until the French made it in the 1930s. So, as a separate nation. So they're telling them, stop letting them become citizens. They're not white. They're Asians. They're Orientals. They're Mongolian. And in Cedar Rapids, where these Muslims and Christians, both Syrian Muslims and Christians, are already established as a community, the local citizens, in particularly white, powerful citizens, stand up and say, no, we know these people. You definitely, this is, first of all, you're not following the Constitution. They defend the citizenship eligibility of these Syrians. That is very different than the way in which they're often treating black people and native people in their courts. So for this purpose, they are getting defense, but they're facing a great stress from the federal government, which is trying to argue, no, they're not white. So before World War I, Syrians are often seen in Cedar Rapids as another white ethnic group. City officials defend their whiteness and their citizenship eligibility against federal prosecution. Okay. And one of the reasons is because, unlike Sioux Falls, for example, the Cedar Rapids is a multi-ethnic town in which no one ethnic group is the majority. Not the Germans, which is oftentimes the case in the Midwest, in particular the upper Midwest, not the Swedes, not the English, not the Irish. And by 1900, if you would have gone to Cedar Rapids in 1900, you might have been surprised about how much non-English you would have seen on the streets. It's not Arabic you would have seen. It was Czechoslovakian language that you would, or Bohemian language as they call it there. I mean, there was the Bohemian Gymnasium. You could study the Czech language in a school. They had already made Cedar Rapids into a place where the public space was used to a non-Anglo culture. And this is one of the reasons why it wasn't so strange to have other ethnic groups with other non-Anglo backgrounds in Cedar Rapids, and what made Cedar Rapids special. That was very different than Michigan City, Indiana. You remember Michigan City was the place where the laborers are working in the Haskell-Barker factory. Before World War I in Michigan City, Syrians are people of color, not white people, subject to police violence as well as social and legal discrimination. They, for example, they don't have command of public space. They are not permitted to go where other white people are allowed to go, like the beach on Lake Michigan, for example. Okay. Haskell and Barker, one of the reasons is that there's an economic function of keeping Syrians repressed is because they're laborers. In fact, before there was ever Detroit, before Detroit became known as the Arab American community of the United States and the Midwest, there were more people working for Haskell and Barker than for Henry Ford. This is something we've forgotten. It's just how important the other parts of our region have been to the making of modern Detroit. Syrians are known as wrestlers. Why? If you think about it, one of the few places where people of color can command public space in a white-dominant society are either in entertainment or in sports. So as long as they were performing, they could command public space. And so wrestling became very popular among our people. And look at, when I saw Yusuf Hussein, I always wondered why, my granddad, Bill Safa, he was very proud of his physical prowess. And he would have us punch him in the stomach. He'd say, "Punch me." And he had these steely abdominals until the day he died. And I was like, where did this come? When I saw this man, I was like, hey, there's my grandfather. I get it. They wanted, when you are especially a male of color and but you're not treated like a man, right? One of the places that you can try to compensate or that you can try to defend yourself is by being strong. And so this kind of strength, and it became a cottage industry where these Syrian, it was in particular Muslims, Syrian Muslim men would train the boys and they would perform in the Opera House and other places in Michigan City. And this guy became so popular, he was from Battle Creek. He became so popular, he had his own fan club in Michigan City. And he was reported, wherever he wrestled, the terrible Turk. That was the other thing, is they oftentimes in Michigan City, they wouldn't call the Syrian Muslims Syrian Muslims. They would call the Christian Syrians in the paper, and they would call all of the, even though they were not Turkish in the least, they would call the Muslims Turks. But they're all Syrian. There are no Turkish. They don't speak Turkish, right? They speak Arabic. So, by the way, you had to have a moniker. Notice that wrestling hasn't changed very much in 100 years. You had to have a moniker there was like the Russian Bear versus the Terrible Turk, or Farmer Bill Hokum of Iowa, But World War I is a turning point in the political lives of Syrian Muslims in the Midwest. The very first conscript into the American Expeditionary Forces from Michigan City is Muhammad, here they have it, Daboja or Dabeja. And he is signing his conscription papers right here. Syrian Christians and Syrian Muslims from Michigan City serve in great numbers in World War I. And one of the favorites of the Syrian Muslims was, guess what? It's another one of the Joe Alis. Remember the Joe Alis from that I showed you? Yeah. So Yusuf Ali here he's a veteran, and he's a member of the armed forces. He comes home and they won't rent him a bathing suit at the Lake Michigan beach. Now you say, why doesn't he get his own bathing suit? Okay, you got to think, bathing suits in 1919 were different than today. They were more like Spanx. I mean, they were body wear, shapewear. They were very complicated contraptions with all kinds of, little. So you wouldn't necessarily want to buy one yourself, right? You want to rent it. Well, they wouldn't. They said, and somebody says, we're not going to let that Turk onto our beach. So Joe Ali sues, and a jury of his white peers decide that's not fair and that he should be allowed to go to the beach. And so Joe Ali's suit integrates the Michigan City beach for Syrian Muslims. It would remain closed to black people until after World War II. But for Joe Ali, though, it becomes possible to go to the beach. What's another takeaway from these people who created this culture in the Midwest? Between World War I and World War II, Muslim religious congregations, like other Midwest congregations, built cultural, social, and political power. They were pathways, not impediments to assimilation. You all in Minnesota know this well. You know that when Swedes and Norwegians and Irish and other ethnic groups built their religious congregations, they did not do so merely to be separate from everyone else, but to accumulate the kind of power and resources they needed in order to participate in the society, in order to run philanthropy, in order to encourage citizenship and patriotism, in order to be part of it. There is nothing more Midwestern than forming your own ethnic religious congregation. Whether you were an Ashkenazi Jew or a holiness Norwegian or a Polish Roman Catholic. This was part of what it meant to be a Midwestern and American between World War I and World War II. And the Syrian Lebanese Muslims were no different. And so, like other Americans, they sought to establish their religious congregations. The first was in Michigan Park, or Highland Park in Michigan in 1921, a building that no longer exists, but was established by the Carew brothers in 1921 in Michigan. Then came the mosque in Ross, North Dakota in 1929. Unfortunately, this building also no longer exists. The descendants of the families have rebuilt a mosque on this place, where there's also a Muslim cemetery, which is still occasionally used in western North Dakota. But the building itself, it was sometimes called a basement mosque because, for those of you who are from rural Minnesota or who have spent time in rural Minnesota, you'll be familiar, especially from the North Country, with buildings. Half of the building is under the ground. And I can just imagine, prostrating, praying on my knees in 20-degree below weather. I would want it to be warmer if you were under the ground. It also just blended in. The one thing that we have publicly from this building is, hold on. You can see one of the doors at the Arab American National Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, if you ever want to visit there. That's a wonderful trip. How far is it from here? Detroit. Oh, it's quite some distance. Well, so you have to make a plan of it, but you'll eat well, you'll enjoy your trip to Dearborn, and and you should go if you haven't been. But you can see the door to this mosque. This one also no longer exists, but the mosque is still operating as a mosque. It just operates in a different building. This is the first permanent mosque, or the oldest continuously operating mosque in the state of Indiana, in Michigan City, Indiana. And you can see it's converted. The building existed before, and they converted it into a mosque. See that chimney there? That's the minaret. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they would pray on this level right here. This is just 2 or 3 blocks from Lake Michigan. Michigan City tore it down in its urban renewal program and they have a museum there now instead. But it's very close to Lake Michigan. So they would pray here, and then down here, they would sing Arabic songs, recite Arabic poetry. They would serve stuffed grape leaves with cinnamon and allspice spiced meat and rice cooked in a tomatoey broth. These warak dawali, dolmas, the Greeks call them. Oh, yeah, grape leaf rolls. Various other kinds of foods, and so that's how they would use it. It was like a community center, which is what a lot of religious congregations, how they operate in the Midwest and in the United States. This is the one that still exists, and it's on the National Register of Historic Places, and you can see it in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. In 1934, it began construction, and it says here, in order to translate for their neighbors, this was built in a residential neighborhood, and to translate what this was, you can see that they called it at first, instead of a mosque, which was not perhaps well known by the neighbors, they called it a temple, right? Muslim temple. The Arabic says Al-Nadi Al-Islami, the Islamic club or group or organization. That's what it says there in Arabic. And similar to that, they would use this part for the prayers, and then in the basement, classes. And it was this group this was a long-running community that would continue to teach about Islam until today for their children, basically. They're establishing this for their children. In Cedar Rapids and across the Midwest, it was the neighborhood Syrian grocery that became an institutional pillar of the community. You might ask, how in the middle of the Great Depression did they raise enough money to build that mosque? Because people were suffering in the Great Depression. There was still money coming into the Syrian Lebanese community because so many of those peddlers had become grocers. And grocery stores were one of the few places where you could obtain credit in the Great Depression, no matter who you were, because you would go and get food, and even if oftentimes the grocer would just let you put it on your account, and then when you did get paid, or when you did get some money, guess where the first place you would come? Now, of course, you could skedaddle from town if you wanted to, but people live in towns. They have to live there. So they come back to the grocery store, they pay their bills, right? People got to eat. And so one of the very few places that grocery stores in the Great Depression were as much banks as they were grocery stores. Okay? And you can see how Igram and Khalil's, for example, they advertise like everybody else. You'll notice that this is a post-prohibition poster. Why? Because they're selling beer. Old Milwaukee, Hunters, I've never had Hunters. And notice that they're also selling pork. So these were not what you would call halal grocery stores. And when asked, they would say, look, I don't eat the stuff myself, but I have to serve my customers. You think the Bohemians, are going to come to my store if I don't have beer and ham? No. So they're serving their customers, and in the end, it was stores like this that made it possible to teach the kids about Islam in this mosque. Right? Same was in Toledo. Over a third of the liquor licenses in Toledo in this period were owned by Muslims. And it was that money that made possible their mosque as well in the 1950s. So things have changed a little bit. This would be frowned upon more in today in contemporary Muslim America, but it was different in the 30s. They didn't just work. They also enjoyed each other's company. They mourned each other's dead. They celebrated marriages, and they would sing and sometimes dance and recite poetry as they gathered together, multi-generations, taking care of one another and enjoying each other's company. For example, this crowd that you see at Michigan City, which is in Kruger Park, and that's a New Deal era building, when the Civilian Conservation Corps and others were building these buildings and public parks all over the country. And you see they're gathering probably three generations here of Syrian Muslims, al-ihtifal al-jamaat Jamiat al-Asr al-Jadid al-Islami. This is the gathering of the new generation Islamic society or club, and that's what they called their mosque, was Asr al-Jadid, the new generation. And if you can see the fashions here, we've got some ladies wearing hijabs, right? And then we've got some men in their newspaper boy Great Gatsby hats, right? And looky here, we got some flapper girls. They're all coming together and celebrating one another. Today we sometimes see, if you turn on the news or you pop into a Facebook group, you hear conversations that somehow immigrants aren't integrating, and that if immigrants stick to their religion and their culture, that they can't become American. This generation proves how wrong that was. Abe Hamid, for example, this is the Quran from which he learned about Islam, brought over with his family. He was raised as a pious Muslim on a farm in Iowa. His Holstein was also an award-winning 4-H animal. Abe Hamid did not see any contradiction between being a good Iowa farm boy and being a good Muslim. And when we don't honor stories like that, we really do a disservice to the truth about American history. It's hard to imagine, with the existence of so much Islamophobia in our current moment, on this moment, just now, just how much people in Iowa celebrated the presence of Syrian and Lebanese Muslims. I mean, today, it's sometimes controversial for a politician to visit a mosque. Well, Iowa's Secretary of State was the headliner at their anniversary of their mosque in 1937. Again, history can come up with surprising. We always think things get better, or we want to hope that they sure do, but they don't necessarily. And we have to remember and honor what happened in the past as much as what we think about in the future, and not assume that things do get better. Now, finally, moving towards a conclusion, the fate of all of these communities I've been talking with you about, it largely depended on historical forces like agricultural economics and industrial growth, not any lack of individual effort or desire of the communities to sustain their congregations. One of the primary messages you'll sometimes hear in immigration history, and this is more from the Oscar Hanlon School of Immigration History, not from the Minnesota School of Immigration History, is that the more assimilated they become, the more they lose their original culture. Okay, that is just not true. Okay, not according to everything that the Immigration History Research Center has shown. Not very far from here. Okay, it just depends on the various factors. Those North Dakota farmers, these are all Muslims you're seeing. That's Mary Juma and her grandkids. Those North Dakota farmers, they worked as hard as anybody to try to make a go of it. But the land simply would not sustain them. So it wasn't because of any kind of lack of interest in Islam that there couldn't be that they couldn't sustain their mosque in Ross, North Dakota. It was because, in the end, Western North Dakota could not sustain intensive agriculture. Many of these people would move to Detroit and Chicago and other cities to get jobs. The same was true in Michigan City. They came from Michigan City and Sioux Falls. People like Ali Said and Alia Ogdi Hassan, they all would eventually go to Detroit because in the 1920s and 30s, Detroit, as you know, made its name in the automobile industry and became one of the great economic success stories of the United States. And so they would move. And it was, when we think of Detroit now as the capital of Arab America, one of the reasons is because all these Midwesterners from the Dakotas and sometimes from Minnesota and from Missouri and from Illinois brought their knowledge, their skills, and their experiences from all over to Detroit, making it what it is today. One final word. And I alluded to this just a moment, began to allude to it again. Writing this book, researching this book, was a deeply emotional experience for me, because by the end of it, I began to think of my own childhood in rural southern Illinois differently. No matter how much my granny had raised me to be a proud person, I always thought of us in a way, or myself, as some kind of foreign intrusion into what was essentially a white person's land. That experience was exacerbated by the number of times during my childhood that I was asked by everybody, "What are you?" Not "who are you?" "What are you?" Which I took to be a question about my race and nationality and religion, anything that would make me a little different than the white majority. Taking this historical journey, rediscovering my ancestors in the Muslim heartland, helped me to see that we in this region have never been all white and all Christian. Never. We have always been religiously, racially, and ethnically plural, diverse. That historical truth is important for those who would rewrite history to eliminate my ancestors and all of us who helped to build this place, the place where we all live, who imagine some fairy tale that somehow the old hometown was always white and Christian and it was all simple. And then suddenly now all these newcomers are here. That's not the truth. That's a myth. The historical truth of our diverse origins is essential to building the heartland that we all truly desire. A place that loves all its people and loves us abundantly. Thank you.
We have some time for audience questions, so if you have a question, raise your hand, I'll run the mic. We do have a virtual audience, so we want to make sure you have the mic so we can all hear the questions.
I wanted to ask about the mass migration from geographic Syria, which we now know as Syria and Lebanon. Did the Christian members of that mass migration and the Muslim members of that mass migration create any kind of community or unified effort for culture and society and workplace, or did they separate and create their own identities within the United States? And would you say something about that then, and how is it now?
That's a great question. Thank you. Yes. The answer is yes. In 1936, representatives from across the Midwest, including Minnesota, came together in Indianapolis to establish the Midwest Federation of Syrian American Clubs. There were Muslims and Christians. Some Armenians joined, because the Arabic-speaking Armenians from Syria, for example, and some Druze, as well as Muslims and Christians, and which is the religion, for example, of Casey Kasem, who used to count down the hits, the top 40. And many of us will remember that. So in 1936, they did so. They also contributed to the Institute of Arab American Affairs and other groups which were, on the one hand, extremely proud of being American and patriotic, supporting, for example, World War II, and also desired and advocated for the establishment of free Arab countries in the Middle East, Egypt, Palestine, Syria, and Lebanon. Those organizations continued to be robust into the 50s and 60s, and then a new wave of immigration after the 1965 Hart-Celler Bill reformed our racist immigration system, which had cut off non-white immigration in 1924 at the height of the Klan, movement. The Klan got its way, and we had the Johnson-Reed Act, which cut off immigration from non-white places. The 65 bill then saw an influx of new immigrants from all over, right? And we know that the Twin Cities in Minnesota is one of the places where you can see how much those immigrants have changed. While that was going on, you had two I'm going to cut to the chase since I have to be quick, it's two main movements. On the one hand, the new Muslims and Christians put most of their time, talent, and resources into building congregations and other religious church and para-mosque institutions, and they began to see their religion, like good Americans, as their primary identity rather than their ethnicity. Okay. So that so many people's claims today in America, if you think of our political landscape, people make claims based on their religion. As a Christian, as a Jew, as a Muslim, as a Hindu, right? You don't have as many people saying, as a Polish person, as a Bohemian or a Czech. Right? So, or as a Hindu, or as an Indian. So that happened, but the old Arab unity did not go away. And if in the book I describe how my granny raised me to be very proud of my Arab identity and to identify with people regardless of their religion. And so the people like Senator James Abu Rezk arose from, he was from the Dakotas, and in around 1980, he established the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee. And so they continued to establish Arab American organizations. They would never be as big as the Muslim or the Christian organizations, okay, among Arabic-speaking people. But they continue to this day, and in fact, we're in a moment in which there's especially among young people, there's incredible pan-Arab unity and concern for the Palestinians, which is crossing religious lines. That's a quick answer.
I have a question from the Zoom audience, and they would like to know whether the Syrian immigrants experienced housing discrimination in the urban areas.
Yes, they did, especially because, for example, in Sioux Falls, so many of these grocers, they would have the grocery store on the first floor of their building, and they would have the living quarters on the second. And their whole life really depended on getting zoning to be able to have that grocery store on the first building. And in some cases, they were not. It depended on the locality. But I document at least one instance in the book in which a Syrian Muslim family is not given the zoning permit, or the neighbors revolt against the zoning permit. I mean, they're given the permit, and then actually it gets taken away by the revolt and revoked by the city because of the neighbors not wanting those Syrians in our neighborhood. So it would very much depend upon the location. In Indianapolis, for example, there was, at first in the 1890s, it was difficult for Arabic-speaking immigrants to move into white neighborhoods, but that was, by the 1920s, all those restrictions had gone, and they were able to move into to most white neighborhoods, except for perhaps the most elite, like where Eli Lilly would live. You know, that's where but those were all private covenantal neighborhoods where very many different people couldn't move in because they were so elite. Eli Lilly established the Lilly Company, which is a very large employer in Indianapolis and a maker of many drugs.
A quick question. So do you have any explanations or theories on how we have mosques in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and Ross, North Dakota, and not in Minnesota? Do they not have enough Muslim population in Minnesota?
That's correct. In certain places like Wisconsin and Minnesota, you did not have as many Muslims as you did in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. So you lack critical mass. The majority of the immigrants were Christian, for sure. And so, and you see various Arabic-speaking churches more Arabic-speaking churches are being established than Arabic-speaking mosques at this time. That does not mean that there were not, for example, in Mankato, by the way, there's a big Arabic-speaking Syrian Lebanese population that goes to Mankato. And that's why you have that talked about in the Betsy Tacy stories, for those of you from Minnesota. But that doesn't mean that there weren't Muslims. There were Muslims, and their stories are yet to be told. There isn't, frankly, a lot of peer-reviewed research on Syrian Lebanese Christians or Muslims in Minnesota. This is a story yet to be written. I'm actually looking forward I am going to be doing some of this work over the next several years. I want to know more about all of these people in places where they didn't necessarily establish the kinds of institutions that would, for which we would know them, but they still lived and worked and participated in the society.
A quick follow-up question. So what can you tell us about the descendants of these immigrants, second, third, fourth generation, so on? Did they hang on to their religion? Did they hang on to the culture? Did they just melted away in the melting pot? Or what can you tell us about this?
Absolutely. So in Ross, Mary Juma's kid Charlie, who was the first Syrian Muslim born in western North Dakota, she said. She said in translation, by the way. She never really learned to speak English very well. He married a non-Arab woman and became a Lutheran, like everybody else in western North Dakota. But he spoke fluent Arabic until the day he died. He had the most wonderful, you can hear a tape of him. He has the most wonderful Lebanese Arabic. And, but where those homesteaders moved to Detroit and Dearborn, they then became essential contributors to not just to religious, but also to cultural and social organizations that were Muslim majority. So it depended on where there was enough people to continue those relationships and those identities, it happened. Where you were one among, and there were just not many other folks. I mean, maybe there was one other family down the road and you didn't get along with them. Then in that, and we have to remember that media, it was very different in the 1920s and 30s than it is today. So you can't just log on to Facebook and continue a virtual community, right? I mean, the actual presence of people mattered too. So it was really that simple, was whether or not there's critical mass. And this is the story of religious identity everywhere. I mean, just think about the way in which, if you go back to the very history of Islam, it took 500 years after the Prophet Muhammad for the majority of people in North Africa and the Middle East to become Muslim. 500 years. They were Christians and Jews and other religions before. So change can happen, right? Sometimes it happens very slowly, and it depends on a number of factors. I would never say this is because of any lack of interest, or it really has to do with historical forces that are greater than individuals.
And I have another one, a question from the Zoom audience, and they would like to know, did the Syrian immigrants bring occupational skills and trades with them to the New World, and were they able to parlay that into business and job opportunities?
They brought significant textile, especially the women, and on the East Coast, many of the women were very skilled textile workers. That would be one example. Two, I document in my book how many of the farmers in Iowa and the Dakotas did bring skills as farmers, but they had to learn new skills in order to participate in what they called dry farming, which was a total failure. You're supposed to somehow unlock the moisture deep underneath the rocky ground, which didn't work. But they did bring those. They had they brought a physical skill, and this is one of the reasons why. So many of them, the Ottoman martial arts were well developed in the Eastern Mediterranean. And this is why so many of our people became known, as athletes. Because they had already cultivated that. They brought their music and their poetry, which became very important to their employment as entertainers at places like the Columbian Exposition of Chicago in 1893, the World's Fair, and then the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. And perhaps most famously for me, my, John Hemingway's brother. This is my great-great-grandfather's tomb in Kennett, Missouri. Or I said Missouri earlier because that's how we said it growing up in Southern Illinois. His brother was named Ernest Hemingway, and he is credited with inventing the ice cream cone at the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904 by turning a zalabiya into a cone. So there were all there were a number of skills, but oftentimes those skills, because their English language was that first generation's English literacy was limited in many cases in the Midwest, as opposed to like the mother colony of New York, where you had Khalil Gibran writing some of the greatest English poetry ever, that was, the prophet, the author of the prophet. They had limited opportunity. Those skills didn't always translate because of that. So it depended.
Dr. Curtis, could you, as a follow-up question, could you explain a little to the audience about the beginning of the early peddlers who came to Cedar Rapids, particularly, my dad did, brought his brothers over who also took the road of peddling, and they actually walked from Cedar Rapids to Mankato to different places. Could you just go back in time a little bit and explain how they became grocers then from that?
Peddling had a fairly low barrier of entry, and like other businesses, our ancestors weren't the only people who were into peddling. There were Jewish peddlers, for example, in many places who weren't necessarily Ashkenazi Jews, German Jews, but rather people who had come from the shtetl, for example, from Ukraine and Eastern Europe. And so we weren't the only peddlers, but peddling was something that you could learn just a few English phrases and get into. And quickly, by the 1890s, several people had established peddling networks, and it was a little bit like an Amway distributorship in that someone would come to a town like Cedar Rapids, and in Cedar Rapids' case, it was Tom Bashara, who was a Christian. And he would then, he became a successful peddler himself. A peddler, of course, is a customer service representative. You learn what your customers want, you bug the heck out of them until they buy something from you. And by the way, women and men were involved in peddling. And the social workers really didn't like this. They didn't like the fact that it was kind of ironic because we sometimes think of Arab women as somehow, put in the home by their men and not allowed out. No, it was the white social workers who wanted to put the Arab women back in the home. They thought it was very uncouth and that they were sexually licentious and such by being out. And this happened quite a lot in the Twin Cities here. If you go back to the newspapers from the 1890s, you can see all these cases in which the social workers, the nice St. Paul social worker women, wanting to put these loose Syrian women back in the house. And they were very concerned about them. But these women were just as good at the men at selling stuff. And they would use whatever they needed to. Oh, here is a holy silk from the Holy Land. The land where Jesus walked. And, whatever it takes. You're trying to make a living, right? So they would, but in the rural parts, they became an essential part of the supply networks for Minnesota farmers because they would indeed, at first they started with these huge packs, which they could, it was a miraculous how much weight they could carry on their back. But as they got more money, they would buy a horse and a carriage and eventually mechanized mechanized transportation, and they would develop, it was kind of like the Swan Man when I was a kid. They would develop these networks where they figure out what you liked, what you needed. You would tell them, okay, I really need, yes, they had needles and thread, they had notions, but they're like, I'm saving up for a rug. Can you get me a rug? I don't want one of these bad rugs that comes off of the Sears catalog. I want a really nice, Oriental rug. Okay, so you can get that. Or I need you to bring me a bunch of cans of, whatever. And so they would develop these supply, and oftentimes what they would do is, before they had their own vehicles or their buggies, they would take the train out from Fort Wayne, Indiana, or Cedar Rapids, and then they'd walk back, and they'd walk the routes back. And so these peddling networks were absolutely essential because what also happened is not only did you learn customer service by becoming a peddler, but you also began to learn how to use credit. And they would do not a bartering system, but they would, where the kind of head of the pyramid, right, like the Tom Bashara of Cedar Rapids, would set up other people. And this is how he could grow a business because he would then get a cut of the sales from the others whom he had set up, right? In our lore, in our lore is we oftentimes remember these people as just very kind people who just helped other fellow Arabs. But there was a financial component to it as well, right? And so they were naturally then, so they had developed assets, they developed credit, and these peddlers became dry goods store owners, and the dry goods store owners became grocers, which is what happened in Cedar Rapids, in Indianapolis, and all across the Midwest. So that's just a little profile, and I say much more about how the business developed in the book.
Professor, up in the back up here. Thank you for your fresh perspectives today. Areas that a lot of us don't know those histories, and that was really interesting. My question for you is, your focus, of course, has been on the Syrian Muslim population that came to the Midwest. Was there a parallel in that 1880 to 1920 era with the Arab, the Egyptian, the Persian Muslims, and what were some of the communities that they may have settled before? I'm assuming a lot of them also migrated to that Detroit, Dearborn area.
Yeah, so these Syrian Lebanese were Arabs. They spoke Arabic. So they were the main, and there were also Palestinians. The Eastern Mediterranean, you have to remember, it's all under Ottoman control. So the modern lines that the Sykes-Picot Agreement would eventually be drawn by the British and the French. So the Eastern Mediterranean got drawn into this thing we call Saudi Arabia. That didn't exist then. Right? It did not, or Kuwait or UAE or all of these things. These are all created by the imperialists, right? Or Transjordan. I mean, Transjordan was just called Transjordan because it was literally across the Jordan. And it was the booby prize that they gave the Hashemite family for allying with them against the Turks in World War I. It's made up. And they weren't, the Hashemites aren't from Jordan, they're from the Hejaz, they're from Mecca and Medina. So okay, so then you had Palestine, which would eventually become Israel in 48, and the French carved out Lebanon. They wanted to create a Christian state but these were all Arabic-speaking countries, all of them, and so those are the Arabs. And Egyptians were also Arabs, and they came in much smaller numbers, and oftentimes though would go home. They did not establish in the Midwest sustained communities. Some Muslims who were here were the Bosnians. The Bosnians in the early 1900s established a long-lasting, they would oftentimes call themselves Bosniaks at the time. And they established long-lasting, their first Bosnian Muslim organization was established in the first decade of the 20th century in Chicago, Illinois. And so there was Bosnians. There were Iranians or Persians, Persian-speaking people in the Midwest, but they did not, again, have the kind of big enough population to establish their organizations. In the 1920s, Iranians who wanted to pray would pray with the Arabs in Detroit, for example, and we have names and we can put that. So that's a sense of, by far, the largest group of Muslims who were foreign-born in the country from 1890 to 1920 were Arabic-speaking Syrian, Lebanese, and Palestinians, or just Syrians, is what they would call themselves at that time. This is not, as I point out in my book, though, remember that it's during the 1920s that African Americans are establishing their own denominations of Islam. Some of them are Sunni, which is the sort of largest group of Muslims. Another group was called the Moorish Science Temple. Another one was called the Adenu Allahi Universal Arabic Association, which is Sunni. So they were establishing several different groups, and in the 1950s, the one that would emerge victorious, beating out everybody by far in terms of numbers, was the Nation of Islam, led by Elijah Muhammad. And by that time, before 1965, the Nation of Islam, a black Muslim group, was by far the largest Muslim organization in the United States. These immigrants had maybe, or their kids had maybe 20 mosques among them. The Nation of Islam had over 100. By 1965. They would again be dwarfed by the million or so Muslims who would arrive from all over the world from 1967 to 2000 and build probably 2,000 mosques, at least 1,000, but today 2,000 to 3,000 mosques in the country. And today's Muslim community is a microcosm of the rest of the Muslim world. Every kind, from all over the world, from Chinese Muslims and Indonesian Muslims to Mexican Muslims here in the United States.
Any final questions?
I have a follow-up question from the Zoom, going back to the housing discrimination. Was this a result of official policies such as our redlining laws, or was it just the bias of individual landowners and property owners?
That's a wonderful question. I am not an expert and have not done primary research on that question, so I can't answer it with authority. It's a great question, and it's an area for future research. My sense, I would begin such research with the sense that it was informal, it was in the neighborhood covenants, it was not in terms of loans. We know for certain that the majority Syrian Lebanese population in the after World War II were able to qualify as white people for loans, and many of them became very successful. People like Danny Thomas, Mitch Daniels, the governor of Indiana, Jim Abnor of the Dakotas, and more, and others you probably know from your local community, who probably lived in white neighborhoods.
So, good question. So what do we have historically? What is the earliest mosque in America then? Would it be in New York somewhere? Because we know that a lot of the enslaved people who are brought here in the 16th, 17th centuries, right? They were a lot of African Muslims, but of course they were not allowed to have a mosque. So what is the earliest mosque we have in the United States?
Yeah, the first Muslims came in the 1500s to the Americas, because why? Remember that before 1492, there had been a Muslim and Jewish presence in Iberia for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so both Jews and Muslims came oftentimes as nominal converts to Christianity, because that was the law in 1492 for Jews, and then in the 1530s you had Moriscos, or Muslims who had converted to Islam. So the first Muslims in the Americas were Andalusi and North African Muslims. Okay. But they were a relatively small population. By the 1600s, the largest population of Muslims were enslaved Muslims. Perhaps 10% of all of the 10 to 12 million enslaved people were Muslim. Tens of thousands of them came to the United States. Many of them attempted religion. For them was different than our religion in that it was oftentimes an inclusive rather than an exclusive practice. So you could be, in West African culture, you could oftentimes practice more than what we would call one religion. You could do hoodoo and be a Muslim at the same time, no problem. Okay, so it depended on who, but they continued to practice. They were not able to establish, again, it was a very small number of people who came to the United States. In Bahia, Brazil, they did establish a Muslim school and a mosque. And they did celebrate holidays as a community. So where there were more Muslims, it's that same issue of critical mass. They established those. So if we look at the Americas as a whole, it was the enslaved African Muslims and the freedmen and women who established the first mosques in the Americas. In the United States, the first mosques were built by non-Muslims. I know for certain by 1893 there were 3 separate mosques in the Chicago's World Fair that were used by Muslims to pray in them with imams. And in fact, on July 4th, 1893, at the Midway Pleasance, the Protestant minister didn't show up for the invocation. And so it was the Muslim imam who gave a dua, supplicatory prayer, to how great the United States was, how wonderful it was, and and then and after he gives this patriotic speech, all the Muslims there cry out, Allahu Akbar! God is great. And so there were actually 3 separate mosques at the 1893's fair. By the end of the decade, there would be 2 rented mosques in New York City. The oldest continuously operating mosque I showed you is is perhaps could be the one in Cedar Rapids. We don't know, but Muslims themselves did not build their own mosque from scratch in this country until 1921 at Highland Park, Michigan.
This is fascinating. And of course, there's always more questions, but Dr. Curtis will be available to sign books and answer questions. Please join me in giving another round of applause.